Our center is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples. Wherever you are on Turtle Island, please think about the traditional lands you are situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands. Today, as we acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples endure in Canada, our thoughts and our hearts are with the community of Tk'emlúps, Tsawitmuk, and all Indigenous peoples as we mourn the 215 Indigenous children found buried at the site of the Kamloops Residential School. We honor the lives of the 215 children by committing to work to end the discrimination against Indigenous children and families living in Canada today. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar, Anti-Asian Racism and Gender-Based Violence, Historical and Contemporary Realities. And now I'm honored to introduce our speakers. I'm going to just share a highlight, but you will find on the slides on your screen more about our speakers. Dr. Jiyoung Lian is an anti-racist feminist and interdisciplinary scholar from South Korea who is currently an instructor in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University. Jiyoung's identity as a feminist scholar and activist link her grassroots experiences with her scholarly work. Avvy is a lawyer and the clinic director of the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, formerly known as the Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. She has worked exclusively serving the legal needs of low-income individuals and families, the majority of whom are non-English speaking immigrants and refugees. Kelly Go was born and raised in Hong Kong and speaks Cantonese, Mandarin, and English. Kelly moved to Canada in 2008 and works as a full-time outreach worker with Swan since 2017. Swan promotes the rights, health, and safety of immigrant women engaged in indoor sex work. I am delighted now to turn the podium over to Jiyoung Lian for her to start our presentation off.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you so much for your introduction. And I would also like to thank organizers for all of their work for this webinar. Like many of you, it has been heartbreaking to hear about the tragic discovery of the bodies of 215 children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School and the horrific car attack on a Muslim family in London, Ontario. The discovery and the horrific attack are another reminder of Canada's deeply traumatic history and contemporary reality of settler colonial violence and racism. I believe we are all here to work together to fight against ongoing settler colonialism and racism. If I briefly add an introduction about myself, I came to Canada 10 years ago from South Korea as an international student, and now I am living, teaching, and working on unceded Algonquin territory as a racialized settler. My understanding of anti-Asian racism in Canada is based on my critical understanding of my own positionality as a racialized settler. I believe discussing anti-Asian racism and exclusion should be in line with full awareness and respect of and support for indigenous resistance and pathway to decolonization. Today, my talk is about the modern minority myth and anti-Asian racism intersected with gender, class, and sexuality. More specifically, I will situate Asian racism in Canada within the history of white settler nation building and how sexualization of Asian women in particular was part of debates related to reproducing white nation, and how the mechanism of inclusion and exclusion surrounding Asian women has continued in diverse forms. I will also introduce the problems of the Asian modern minority myth that has played a key role in perpetuating the existing racial hierarchies and norms in Canada, and how this myth has hidden and individualized the suffering of Asian women whose lives are structured differently based on the intersections of gender and class and sexuality. Uh, Okay, so first, I am going to talk about how the exclusion of Asians and anti-Asian racism against Asian was an integral part of white nation building in Canada in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Asian immigrants were excluded in many different forms, and as many of you are already aware of the historical exclusion of Asian immigrants through the notorious head tax that was imposed on Chinese immigrants to prevent them from settling down in Canada, and followed Chinese Exclusion Act and Komagatamaru incident that denied the entry of South Asian immigrants and the internment of Japanese immigrants and Canadians who were constructed as enemy within during the World War II. For the last 3 decades, these historical wrongdoing have been addressed by political mobilization of Asians in Canada who demanded the official apologies of this historical racism from the government, and they demanded institutional support to rectify those historical wrongdoing. This historical exclusion shows how Asian immigrants were constructed as others who did not fit into the idea of white Canadian nation. This historical legacy of constructing Asians as perpetual others is also reflected in the contemporary form of racism and hate crimes against Asians. To Asians, verbal and physical assaults that have significantly increased during the COVID-19 pandemic are usually accompanied with the very specific racist remark, go back to China or go back to your country. In other words, as critical racist activists, they have commented Asians in Canada have been constructed as perpetual others who do not belong to Canadian nation regardless of how many generations they have lived. I can say that this is an everyday experience for many Asian descent immigrants and Canadians. And another important aspect of racism against Asians in relation to white settler nation building was the ways in which how sexualization of Asian women, in particular Chinese women in the 19th century, was understood and constructed as threat to reproducing the white nation. Through political activism by Asian descent Canadians, many people are now aware of the head tax. However, not everyone is aware of how the sexuality of Chinese women was particularly linked to promiscuity and how Chinese women were constructed as potential sex workers and threats to reproducing the white nation. The Chinese Immigration Act 1885 specifically singled out Chinese sex workers as a group who are not allowed to come to Canada. This ban was based on a widespread public perception at that time about Chinese sex workers who were understood as someone luring young white men. However, scholars point out that despite the widespread public perception, there were very few Chinese sex workers. So Woon's research showed that in British Columbia in 1885, there were only 70 Chinese sex workers in Chinese population of 10,550. And in Victoria in 1902, white sex workers outnumbered Chinese ones by 150 to 4. Associating Chinese women's sexuality with promiscuity and constructing Chinese women as potential sex workers in general became factors to justify the exclusion of Chinese women. This rationale sounds very similar to the remarks repeated by the recent Atlanta shooting offender. In his imagination and North American popular culture in general, Asian women have been constructed as exotic sexual objects of white men. And at the same time, Asian women were also constructed as threats. The white man's gaze towards Asian women are so prevalent, and particularly in the media and online dating websites. And I can say the majority of Asian women, including myself, are subject to those forms of white man's gaze in many circumstances in both public and private spaces. Long-standing Orientalism and colonial discourses have shaped Asian women as particular sexual objects. This particular construction of Asian women as exotic sexual object is in line with a broader colonial discourse of Asian women throughout the history of European colonization of the Asian Pacific and colonial discourse of Orientalism. Asian women's bodies are fetishized in a certain way, small, docile, or cute, or exotic. The sexualization of Asian women and the fetishization of Asian women's bodies are so normalized in North America, and sometimes those descriptions are considered even compliments. Also, the sexualization of Asian women was closely tied to the idea of reproducing white nation. The fear of interracial relationship during the late 19th century and 20th century was the basis of the exclusion of Asian women in the immigration process. The ways in which Asian women's sexuality is understood in the context of interracial relationship and reproduction of the white nation in the past are in fact reflected in a recently leaked online video that includes conversation among several police officers in Ottawa. So in April, oh, okay. In April this year, one video was posted online that included dialogues among police officers in Ottawa. This video was recorded in the summer of 2019. If I briefly show some of their dialogue, our days are done, white man's days is done, you are onto something. The population of North America, we are the minority, I think, even at this point. You go to Toronto, and every couple you see walking by is a mixed couple. You don't see white and white people together. It's white and Asian, white and East Indian. I told my son he can find a Chinese Asian girlfriend. If he wants to stay in the mix, get your foot in the door. These dialogues starts with a lamentation that the white man's era is gone, and then it connects to the sentiment of losing their majority status in Canada, used to be a white nation to them. As Professor Xiaobei Chen says in her CBC interview, this shows the quote, enduring notion of white ownership of this nation, unquote. And then this conversation is transitioned to the discussion of the increase of interracial relationship that was constructed as something different from white and white people's relationship. This is similar to the logic of how the regulation of interracial relationship was understood as an integral part of reproducing the white nation. And then one of the officers talked about encouraging his son to be involved in interracial relationship with Asian women. It is also noteworthy that the police officer mentioned his son to find a Chinese or Asian girlfriend, not vice versa. It would have sounded different if the police officers had told that his white daughter to find an Asian man. So what do you think? So here again, the colonial assumption of Asian women as a sexual object of white men is taken for granted. This very recent casual conversation by officers shows the historical continuity of racialized objectification of Asian women's sexuality and their fear of losing white nation. Another important dimension that I want to talk about to discuss racism against Asian in relation to white nation building is the Asian mother minority myth. The Asian mother minority myth has been popularized since the 1960s. This myth focuses on prevailing stereotypes of Asians as hardworking, independent, and economically prosperous, but not politically challenging the existing racial rules of Canada and the United States. So that's why they are mother minority. Therefore, some even name Asians in North America honorary white, which symbolizes the compliance of Asians. So if you look at a Wikipedia page on honorary white, you can see the general perception of East Asians in North America. For some people, this myth seems to be in contrast to the very exclusive history in the late 19th and early 20th century that we just discussed. However, I argue that this myth itself also a part of white nation building and works as a discursive tool to perpetuate the existing racial rule by denying deeply rooted systemic racism in North America. It is important to note that the emergence of the mother minority myth was overlapped with the period of active civil rights movement and anti-racist movements in the United States and Canada. The myth has been used against Indigenous, Black, and other racialized groups, and it has disrupted interracial solidarity. Most of all, this myth in fact hides many issues that Asians experience, including racism, poverty, labor abuse, and psychological needs. And this narrative discourages Asian groups' potential collective actions to overcome challenges. The sentiment that Asians have to take care of, their problems by themselves without troubling others. This sentiment hides socioeconomic, political, educational, and psychological needs of Asian Canadians from public view. Like other racialized groups, Asians are so diverse and their lives are different based on the intersection of gender, class, race, disability, immigration status, citizenship status, etc. In a short conversation article that I co-authored, I mentioned that Canada's 2016 census data that shows among Korean, Arab, and West Asian Canadians, the poverty rate ranged from 27% to 32%. Among Chinese and Black Canadians, the poverty rate reached 20%. At the same time, it is also true that Asian Canadians are highly represented in skilled occupation, particularly among those born in Canada. In other words, there is a huge discrepancy among Asian diaspora communities. The high poverty rates of Asian Canadians suggest that they are also overrepresented in low-paying occupations, particularly among immigrants. The tone of the mother minority myth systemically excludes the reality of working-class Asian Canadian women who are mainly employed in feminized workforce, including domestic and care work, and service industry and sex industry. These feminized low-paying workforces have been mostly taken up by racialized women and mostly Asian women. As Asian women workers are stereotyped as an ideal docile labor force in international migration labor market. Most of all, it is important to mention that Asian women workers who have precarious migration status with various reasons are particularly vulnerable to labor exploitation, abuses, and police violence coming from potential threats of deportation. However, these women's stories are totally silenced in the celebrated myth of Asian success. I'm sure other two panelists would touch upon these issues more in depth. So in conclusion, in this talk, I try to situate Asian racism against Asia in historical and contemporary context of Canadian nation building. Asians had been either totally excluded or celebrated as someone who do not challenge the existing rules of white settler society. I believe, therefore, our struggle to fight against racism and the modern minority myth should be discussed in the context of settler colonialism by recognizing us as racialized settlers and by building solidarity with indigenous, Black, and other racialized groups in a bigger framework of decolonization. Our anti-racist struggle should be in line with full awareness and respect of and support for indigenous resistance and pathway to decolonization. Thank you for listening and looking forward to having conversation with you. Thank you.
And now we'll call on Avvy Go to present. Thank you, Jiyoung.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to be part of this very important discussion. And of course, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. And of course, today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across the Turtle Island. And as settlers, we are very grateful to the Indigenous communities for allowing us to be part of their territory. And we do appreciate having the opportunity to work towards reconciliation and social justice. And I also want to echo the statements previously shared about the horrific incidents and the discovery, or I guess rediscovery, of the Indigenous children in BC, and of course the murder of the 4 Muslim family members in London, Ontario. And here, if I could take this opportunity to urge all levels of government to work with community groups to address all forms of racism and to adopt the 94 call to action by the TRC. And I'm here today to, sort of talk about, the anti-Asian racism from, of course, the historical and as well as the contemporary setting as well. Dr. Lian has covered a lot of the stuff that I want to talk about. So hopefully I will go through the slide much faster. And if I do run out of time, please remind me. So I am going to start with some historical context, but probably very quickly. And then I will follow that with some of the current day manifestation of anti-Asian racism, some of the legal issues faced by the clients that we see at the clinic, and some of the advocacy work that our clinic has done to advance gender-based equality and other form of racial equality. But I do want to start by talking about systemic racism because, I've been doing a lot of these workshops over the last year, particularly during the pandemic. And I don't want people to walk away from these webinars thinking that racism against or anti-Asian racism only happens on an individual levels. It's only those, however, horrible these incidents are, like, people getting attacked or murdered on the street, and that's just the only kind of racism that we experience. In fact, from my point of view, it is even more important to talk about systemic racism because it's more insidious and it's harder to overcome because it's embedded into all of our institutions, something that we don't see a lot or even discuss a lot. And I believe that if we don't acknowledge the existence of systemic racism, we cannot address other forms of individual violence and hate and racism. Oops. So one of the, oh shoot, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at. So one way that systemic racism manifests in Ontario and Canada is actually in poverty, in the poverty rates. So here, these are data based on Census 2016. And so as you can see, if you're a person of color, you are anywhere between 2 to 6 times more likely to live in poverty. For a non-racialized group, meaning white, your poverty rate is around 11.5%. But if you're Chinese, it's double that amount. South Asian is 18%, and Southeast Asian is 18%. If you're West Asian, actually the figure is around 33%. Korean is around 31%. And one of the key reasons why poverty is racialized is because of the fact that 75% of our income derives from employment. So if there's racism and sexism within the labor market, then it follows that women, particularly women of color and racialized people, would be more likely to live in poverty because they are less likely to get into high-paid jobs, or because they experience higher unemployment rates compared to white people. So here are just some figures. Again, it's based on census data. It shows, for instance, like racialized women earn 58 cents on the dollar earned by a man in Ontario. So that is actually based on the long-form census in 2015. And for racialized men, that the gap is about 24 cents. And there's a study that was done by U of T and Ryerson back in 2017 that shows that if you're a person with Asian-sounding name, then you are at least 30% less likely to be called for job interviews. Give everything being equal, like you have the same qualification as someone who has a Caucasian name. And similar study was done in 2009 by UBC with a similar result. And of course, we know that COVID-19 has really exacerbated many forms of inequalities, including racial inequality. And here are just some figures around the unemployment rate, again, showing that people of color, including South Asian and Chinese, experience a much higher unemployment rate or much higher increase in unemployment rate. And here's a result of a more recent study, again, by Statistics Canada, showing the Southeast Asian Canadians experience an increase in unemployment to 20.1%, meaning every 1 in 5 Southeast Asian Canadians was unemployed at that time, which is extremely high. And we also know that there, of course, it's not just about race, but gender is a factor as well. So RBC did a report around Canadian women who have lost their jobs during the pandemic. And about 100,000 of them, RBC report, will never return to the workforce. And the report also shows that job loss rates among visible minority women, that's the term that was used by the RBC report, is even higher than, sort of white women. And many of them face double-digit unemployment compared to, 9.7% for women overall. And here's the figure for some of the particular, on a disaggregated race-based data basis, showing the gap, like, meaning how are you compare to women overall. So the only group that was doing better in terms of employment is Filipino, which I think it's because many of them are in the healthcare sector. And so maybe in that way, they are less affected. But then everybody else, Black, Chinese, Southeast Asian, Arab, Latin American, they are all worse off compared to women overall. And so for Chinese, I think it's like around, they're, worse off by 4%. Arab is like, by 12%, and so on and so forth. And of course, we have also heard about the rise of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism, in particular during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's a report that our clinic was part of in collaboration with Chinese Canadian National Council of Social Justice, as well as CCNC Toronto chapter and Project 1907 in Vancouver. People reported their incidents of racism online to our online tool called covidracism.ca. Over 1,100 reports were incidents were reported. What is alarming is that women made up of 60% of those who experience racism, according to this report. And also people who are younger, people who are older, as well as people who do not speak English as a first language are also more likely to experience racism, as well as experiencing greater emotional and psychological impact. I don't want to go through the history again because I think Jiyoung really went through it in great detail. The only thing I would actually add is that apart from, sort of the head tax and exclusion act, remember Chinese were brought to Canada to build a railroad, and 80,000 Chinese actually paid the head tax. So as they are here, they could not afford to pay more head tax to bring their family. And therefore, at one point, there was, this called bachelor society in Canada's Chinese communities, because the women were not allowed to come. So there's, in some communities, there's like a ratio of 1 to 2,000, like, sort of like there's only one woman for every Chinese, 2,000 Chinese men. And besides these immigration restrictions and exclusions, Chinese were also not allowed to vote until 1948. And because they're not allowed to vote, they were also not allowed to enter many different professions, including the profession of law. And one of the things that I want to highlight is the one particular aspect of the COVID racism is this whole idea of yellow peril, meaning that the Chinese, and in particular, as well as Japanese, back in the late 1800s, they were seen as unsanitary. Chinatown was, described in the same way as it was a sewage system. We had a royal commission describing Chinatowns as hotbeds of diseases. All of those were used to justify excluding Chinese immigration to Canada. And so this yellow peril idea is reflected in the current day and present day anti-Asian racism. When it's so easy for people to say that Chinese were responsible for bringing the COVID-19 virus to Canada. In fact, even before COVID-19 had a name, when Canada only had one case of coronavirus, we were already seeing Chinese communities being blamed. And in York region, one of the cities in Ontario, the school boards received over 10,000 petitions from parents who want the school boards to stop Chinese students from entering entering the school at that point. And that was back in January 2020, before the pandemic was even declared. And of course, this perpetual foreigners idea, as Jen has mentioned, also allow us to believe that, this is the Chinese as foreigners was responsible because they're so dirty that they are bringing the virus into Canada. And actually, on top of that, Angus Reid released a report just this morning that they surveyed Canadians, non-Asian Canadians, as well as Asian Canadians. And they found that 1/3 of non-Asian Canadians believe that Asian Canadians, or Chinese Canadians are loyal, more loyal to China than to Canada. So this foreign perpetual foreigner ideas is now actually caught up in this global politics, where more and more Canadians are seeing China as a threat to Canada, and they are by extension seeing Chinese Canadians as threat to Canada as well. So it is very alarming, even more so than I think the COVID-19 virus. The only thing I would want to add around the model minority myth, sort of like the flip side to what Jen has talked about, where Chinese Asian women was being seen as submissive, and that we don't speak out, is that when we do speak out, people like myself, when we do speak out, we are being attacked, we're being seen as ungrateful, we are seen as portrayed as troublemaker, and that what we say about racism and our experience of discrimination is being discounted and not being believed. And I saw also there is another flip side to, I think, the model minority myth, is that whatever as we said, like the challenges that we experience are not being believed or not being seen as important enough, right? So this is in contrast to the lived realities of many of the clients that our clinics serve. Many of them, because we're a legal clinic, so we of course emphasize on the access to legal services and justice system, and the barriers that our clients face, because we serve people from the Chinese, Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian communities. All of them face this kind of systemic barriers. And what is more important is that there is systemic racism within the Canadian law of policies, and we are not acknowledging the systemic racism as it pertains to Asian Canadians by using the model minority myth to discount any criticism that people like myself have about the systemic racism. So this model minority myth really works very well for people in power to not have to deal with any issue pertaining to us. So here I just want to highlight some of the examples, like, sort of like you could name many examples of how race, gender kind of mixed together to put people in color and women of color in particular in a submissive position, make sure they stay marginalized. One particular example is the Canada Child Benefits, which is actually based on immigration status. So if you don't have permanent resident status or citizenship status, even when you're working legally in Canada, filing income tax, have Canadian-born children, you're still not able to access CCB, which is touted as a key or core part of Canada's poverty reduction strategy, and it's actually CCB that is helping Canada to reduce child poverty by a significant percentage, but it doesn't benefit everyone. And many of the people who are affected by this, of course, are women, because women are more likely to access CCB, and particularly women of color, because most of the people without status or with precarious immigration status would be racialized. There are other examples as well. I don't want to kind of go into detail, and hopefully we will have more time to discuss in our discussion session later on. And here I just want to highlight some of the examples that our clinic has engaged in to try to address racial equity. These are cases that impact racialized communities in particular. Of course, within the criminal system, people of color, who are more likely to be, sort of found themselves in the criminal justice system, and have also to face the immigration consequences when they are being found guilty, and face the possibility of deportation and removal from Canada. We have dealt with cases of racial profiling and unlawful detention by police in the case of a Vietnamese Canadian person. We've done a lot of advocacy before the UN. Here again, just some examples of our UN advocacy, sort of including our report to the UN Special Rapporteur regarding the rise of anti-Asian racism, Canada's compliance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW, so that's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and of course CERT as well. And all of those are just examples how we're using international human rights instrument to advance racial equity domestically. And here's an example of how we have used test case litigation and systemic advocacy to advance issues that are important to our community. And you're welcome to check our website to look at the current litigation on the Canada Child Benefits. And there's a petition to the House of Commons on that issue as well. And finally, I want to include the Color Poverty, Color Change website. You'll find a lot of disaggregated race-based data looking at how racialized groups are being affected differently in different areas, including housing, employment, income security, immigration, criminal justice, and so on and so forth. Because I think without disaggregated data, race-based data, we will never find out how different racialized communities, including Asian communities, Blacks, and other racialized groups, would be differentially impacted by our laws and policies. So we've been advocating for disaggregated race-based data for a very long time. So that's it for now for me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Avvy. And now we're going to call on Kelly to make her presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Go. I'm the outreach coordinator at Swan. I'm coming to you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. As an organization, Swan is horrified and deeply heartbroken to hear the discovery of the 215 Indigenous children in Kamloops. And also our condolences goes to the family and also the families, the Muslim families that were murdered in London, Ontario. Today I'm going to be talking about what Swan is and the work that we do, and also some of the challenges that we face. Trying to go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to Swan. Swan supports migrant and immigrant women who do indoor sex work through providing direct services and systemic advocacy in the lower mainland of BC. Swan grew out of a pilot community healthcare initiative that extended health outreach to local massage parlors. And during the project, we recognized that the women working in massage parlors were dealing with a host of issues that were much broader than sexual health. The concerns of the women working in the massage parlor had were issues related to the law, immigration, and safety, among others. So at the end of the project, we recognized how important outreach work was and decided to continue working together. And in 2002, the outreach workers formed Sex Workers Action Network. The acronym is also SWAN. In 2008, we became a nonprofit society and also changed our name to Supporting Women's Alternative Network to ensure the inclusion of immigrant and migrant women who do sex work but do not self-identify as a sex worker. And in 2007, we became a registered charitable organization. Currently, SWAN provides social, legal, immigration, and health and housing information to immigrant and migrant women who do sex work from Richmond to Abbotsford in BC. On a systemic level, SWAN is active in challenging mainstream anti-trafficking discourses that encourage law enforcement actions that harm migrant and immigrant sex workers. So who do we serve? SWAN supports over 500 immigrant and migrant self-identified women annually who work in indoor sex work venues like massage parlors and apartments. Over 90% of the women we serve are from East Asia. And we work with women with various types of immigration status, Canadian citizen, permanent residents, visitor, international students, women with work visa, women who are waiting for immigration application approval. And we also work with individuals who are here with precarious immigration status or no status at all. So now I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about the current legal context that SWAN's constituent is facing, because these are the important backdrop of various barriers and vulnerabilities that the women we support face every day. And these policies and laws are also deeply racialized and gendered. So I will give you a brief overview. In Canada, under the Canadian Prostitution Law, which is called the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, we also call it PCEPA, selling sex in Canada is not illegal. However, many activities associated with it are. So PCEPA made it a crime to purchase sex, communicate for the purpose of purchasing sex, keep the company off, or benefit materially from a sex worker, to advertise sexual services provided by anyone but the sex worker, and the advertisement itself must not explicitly offer sex for sale. So I understand that this might be a lot of information to take in, but if you truly need one sentence to cover the criminal law, the Canadian prostitution law that we have, is that selling sex in Canada is not illegal, but many activities associated with it are. And it is also important to think about what is being assumed by the state for it to have this law. So the immigration prohibition is another piece in the broader legal context that function to control racialized bodies and movement. The immigration and refugee protection regulations have a prohibition on sex work. Essentially, only Canadian citizens can do sex work because it prohibits foreign workers, students, visitors from working in any capacities for a business providing striptease, erotic dance, escort services, or erotic massages. So this restrictive work permit policy increased immigration enforcement, which means that immigrant and migrant sex workers are structurally vulnerable to various kinds of abuse. And this leads us to crimmigration. Crimmigration is the fusion of criminal justice and immigration enforcement. It generally refers to criminal law enforcement technique being used for further immigration purposes, including workplace searches and detention, as well as the use of deportation carried out by the Canadian Border Services Agency. So next. So what does this mean? What does the law translate into the realities of immigrant and migrant sex workers? It reinforces a lot of the racist stereotypes, particularly against Asian women. And some of these descriptions on the slide are the underlying assumptions of our current legal system about immigrant and migrant women who do sex work. And next, please. So the laws we have systematically created an environment that is dangerous for immigrant and migrant sex workers. It created vulnerability to violence. The criminalization of sex work systemically denies immigrant and migrant sex workers the same equality, rights, and protection as other citizens. The pervasive misrepresentation based on racist, classist, and gender stereotypes about racialized women, in particularly Asian women, have created much misinformation about migrant and immigrant sex workers, including the widespread misunderstanding that immigrant and migrant women, Asian women particularly, who do sex work are trafficked and are in need of saving. Under the current prostitution and immigration laws, sex work, sexual exploitation, human trafficking are legally viewed as one and the same. Immigrant and migrant sex workers are perceived to be trafficking victims, and we need to understand that sex work is not trafficking, but the laws we have right now are fitting sex workers into this binary of victim or criminal. The laws, along with widespread campaign on human trafficking, also means that immigrant and migrant sex workers are subsequently under increased surveillance and harassment by police and bylaws officer. And for immigrant and migrant Asian sex workers, they are under this constant threat of deportation and detention. Asian women who do sex work are portrayed as victims and are often assumed to be young, voiceless, passive. Maintaining a victim status, even unwanted victim status, is incentivized. If a sex worker does not perform the victim role, they risk being identified as a criminal and sometimes even a trafficker themselves. Asian sex workers who are victims of crime can lose their victim status when they do not fit into the expectation of being passive and or perform the stereotypes of Asian women, for example, a traffic victim. This again can mean increased surveillance, investigation, arrest, deportation, and detention. And these are highly racialized and gendered narratives that serve to erase the complexity, humanity, and the richness of immigrant and migrant sex workers' lives, rendering them to tired stereotypes that increase physical violence against sex workers and render them disposable and deportable by the Canadian state. The majority of Swan's constituents do not have legal protection from violence under the current law. And another piece of it is that perpetrators understand and know this and act with relative impunity. Many know that this community cannot safely report any crimes or violence to authorities without risking their own arrest, detention, and deportation. So when migrant or immigrant sex workers report violence, there is only ever one of two outcomes. One, she might become the target of a prostitution or trafficking investigation, or she's arrested, detained, and deported for an immigration violation. So this also means that immigrant and migrant sex workers are often reluctant to access health, social, and other services. This really just paints a picture of the white savior mentality of the Canadian state and the legal and immigration system through various ways of racialized control of movement. And so yeah, I'm going to stop my presentation here. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to ask now that our panelists Avvy and Kelly and Jiyoung all turn their cameras back on so that we can have a discussion based on some questions that our collaborators had sent in prior to the webinar. And when we're finished that, we'll move into the questions that participants have submitted for today. I'd like to start with you, Avvy, if I could. And the first question is, what types of structural changes need to occur within traditional responses or approaches to gender-based violence that would improve outcomes for survivors experiencing anti-Asian racism and gender-based violence?
So thank you very much for this question. It's not an easy one to answer, but also because, I mean, it depends on the context in which the question is asked, right? So I can only speak to the work that our clinic does and the clients that we serve. So as I mentioned, like we deal with Chinese, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian communities. Many of the clients that we serve are people without status or with precarious status. They face barriers, linguistic barriers and so on and so forth. So I think a lot of the stuff that we want to see change will be issues that would affect this particular groups, right? How do we remove barriers for people, who may not, I guess, as Kelly mentioned, may not even seek assistance because of their status, because they fear deportation, or even those who do, they face a lot of barriers, right? Language is a big issue for many of our clients. So even if you look at, sort of like the domestic violence kind of context, this is one aspect of the gender-based violence that we see. So like a lot of time it started with someone calling the police, and usually it's the men who abuse the woman. So somehow the client that end up with us, the woman will be referred to a shelter, for instance, right? So, and then eventually they come to our clinic. It depends on the situation. We will be helping them with their immigration matter or with some other matter, right? So, I mean, in a way, those who end up with our clinic are quote unquote the lucky ones, because we are then able to try to help them navigate the system, try to get them status. But a lot of them may not end up with the service providers who understand the issues or are able to help them, work through some of these challenging legal factors, because the system itself is still stacked against them, right? So example, even though we have a particular policy on immigration that says we will provide status for people who are domestic violence victims, but there are still many clients who are DV victims who are denied status, right? So I have actually right now I have a case before the federal court, sort of like because the client has been denied status after a very serious domestic violence incident where she, like, her bone was broken. Her boyfriend tried to rape her. Like, you're talking about some very serious sort of injuries and trauma, and yet she was still denied status. So I think structurally, policy-wide, we need to look at those things and how do we really ensure that the DV victims, or whatever context, so why would we want to if so why would we want to make it so hard for people who face violence in coming forward to seek help? But I think within the shelter system and other kind of mainstream kind of referral system, I think there's also need to be better understanding of the issues that these community members face, and better understanding of the law, right? I think that's another missing piece as well. And I think sometimes, not all the times, we do come across shelter workers or others who, don't have some preconceived notion about how a victim should act, right? If she's not, submissive enough, maybe she's not a victim, that kind of stuff, right? So her credibility will be questioned, those kind of stuff. So I think maybe more anti-Asian racism training, as well will be needed. So just some of my response.
Right. Well, thank you, Avvy. I'm just wondering, Kelly, if there's anything you want to add in terms of either programs that you think have been particularly effective for immigrant and refugee sex workers, or not, in terms of what is working. Are there examples you can pull from in terms of support services or other interventions?
Yeah. So because we work with immigrant and migrant women who most of the time they simply have questions about laws and immigrations or health related questions. So when it comes to gender-based violence, it happened, but majority of the time it's cause for those questions. But for Swan's constituency in general, there is very limited options in regards to various support services that they can access. Even just shelter, even healthcare, it's difficult because of precarious immigration status or the lack of status. And like Avvy said, language barriers, and on top of that, there's also stigma on sex work. But for Swan, because we believe in health and safety over status. So what we do here is it's free and confidential services. Women do not need to provide their legal names to access our support or information. We don't have an intake form. We don't ask about immigration status. We don't even ask about details about their work. So, and also we provide services in the language that they prefer. Right now we have Mandarin, Cantonese, and English. We also try to ensure that there are multiple ways for them to access our services anonymously from telephone, text, in person, or other social media platform. But I think in terms of accessing other organization services or referring out, we have to do a lot of homework to make sure that that place is sex work positive, sex work supportive, our understanding of the nature or the stigmatized nature of sex work also would accept people with precarious immigration status. So what the people we serve need is low barrier, right-based approach that emphasize on self-determination, essentially. So yeah.
Thank you. I want to move on to another question, and I want to call on you, Jiyoung, if I could, please. And I know different presenters made mention of COVID and how it both obviously very contemporary, but how it also dovetails with what we know in terms of the historical issues that you raise. So the question is, the issues of gender-based violence and anti-Asian racism, and then the contemporary crisis of COVID-19 are too often framed in isolation from each other. How do you discuss and politicize these issues in your everyday work to ensure it is framed as an intersectional concern?
Yeah, I see that, like, particularly many people, what I found was that they think that because of COVID-19, now, and racism against Asian and hate crimes against Asian actually has started. And however, I mean, as I really try to want to mention and emphasize, was that I would say COVID-19 was one of just the contemporary incident that just revealed what was going on from the history up to now. But at the same time, I do not also want to emphasize that there is only historical continuity, because that the forms of racism against Asians, I can also see that there has been certain differences, the different forms of actions against Asians. And also but but at the same time, yes, it's very important to look at the intersectionality approach, because not every Asians are having the same experience in terms of how they are facing, like the racism. But at the same time, one thing I found out is because that this particular form of racism against Asians through the COVID-19 has been also very random street attack, solely based on the the faces and physicals features. So I also could actually say that it actually have created much more political awareness of Asians living in North America. So I think it's really important to also have that awareness of how that racism has actually affected all Asians. But it does not mean that all Asians are facing the same experiences. And also I think Avvy was also sharing that how those even physical attacks and verbal attacks has been particularly targeting many women and younger or older people. So our experiences should not be actually homogenized as one way and one form. And also the reason I was also trying to look at the history was because particularly with as we saw from the Atlanta shooting incident, the recently that tragic incident, the Asian women's experiences with that racism, particularly the sexualization of Asian women, has been much more prevalent and normalized, but has not really spoken out. So I think I try to really emphasize that, like how those sexualization has been really normalized for the Asian women. So that's one way I'm trying to show how both we have actually with the COVID-19, more people are aware of those common experience being considered perpetual others on streets. So like we in Ottawa, some of Asian people who met actually online and on the to organize the vigil for victims of that Atlanta shooting victims, and we were really surprised because we were able to really see what's going on the ground, even in Ottawa that we are living together, and how those violence has been so common to us. And yeah, so I mean, I'm on really like intersectionality approach is really important, but at the same time now I'm also trying to have those common ground as a nation together without really losing those differences among people.
Thank you. Avvy, did you want to add anything?
No, I think Jen really covered a lot of stuff that I agree with, right? So and really I think workshops or webinars like this really remind people that anti-Asian racism did not begin with COVID-19, and it's not going to end with the end of the pandemic neither. So I think it's important for us to emphasize the systemic nature and the historical context, as well as the broader context of racism and white supremacy in Canada, right? So, I mean, if you believe that racism is based on white supremacy, then as long as we have that, then any forms of discrimination or racism is not going to go away. So I think, but I do agree also that it really gives the COVID-19 actually somehow helped spark a lot of discussion, both within the Asian Canadian communities and in the broader society also, although I think to a much lesser degree in the broader society, about the presence of anti-Asian racism. And I think even as we discuss, it is very much still kind of at the very superficial level of, I'm being attacked on the street, or someone spat at me, without really understand the broader context and also the structural way in which racism manifests in Canada.
I add one more point?
Yes, of course, Jiyoung.
And also, I think one thing I also like to highlight is that the Asian immigrants in Canadian or Asian descent Canadian or Asians living in Canada, actually all of them have their own different historical, like colonial history. They bring their own countries, right? So yes, we are like Asian descent immigrants and Canadians. I hear we are also, facing those racism, and also as part as a racialized immigrants, we are also settlers. We are also being on this indigenous colonial situation and context. But at the same time, also Asians among us, there are really like very heterogeneous history of their own countries of origin, also has different meanings of different colonial history that actually also affecting the lives of us living in Canada. So I think that intersectionality lens need to be much also broader to include those colonial history back in their countries of origin, then how those are also playing out in the context of Canada.
Can I just add one thing though? And I'm not going to, I totally agree with you, but I think it's very important to remember also, there are many Asian Canadians who have been in Canada for a very long time. So I think one worry I have is often that we forgot that, some of my friends they are 6, 7 generations Canadians. But because of the perpetual foreigner myth, that doesn't matter how long they've been in Canada, they are still considered as foreigner or as immigrant, that they are not, right? So
I want to switch over to you, Kelly Go now. And one of the questions is the absolute recognition that there's a need for public education, public buy-in, and meaningful funding to address issues around these historical and contemporary issues. So absolutely critical. But the questioner, it really wants to know, how do each of you suggest that we move beyond recognition and towards meaningful actions? And they'd like you to think of your response in terms of everyday citizens, on the part of governments, different sectors. And I wondered if you would start us off, Kelly.
Yeah, I think one thing really important is to learn about, for Swan and the people that we serve here, to learn about the difference between sex work and trafficking. Most importantly, the harms of anti-trafficking campaigns and the enforcement on immigrant and migrant sex workers. Speak out against sex work stigma, misogyny, and racism, particularly from a labor perspective, because moral perspectives on sex work or on sex impedes sex workers from achieving labor rights. And we all have to have a part to play in addressing these harmful perspectives and actions when they occurred. I think also to connect with other organizations, if there are audience who want to connect with Swan about, like, if we can collaborate to create a space or come up with something that can work for migrant sex workers with precarious status. Also, support full decriminalization. Full decriminalization of sex work means not only removing the prostitution law, but for immigrant and migrant sex workers, the removal of immigration prohibitions on sex work, because if not, then immigrant and migrant sex workers are going to be left behind, essentially, and the oppressions and barriers that they're facing will continue without that.
Thank you. Jiyoung?
Yes. Yeah. I think for me, I actually mentioned like 3 particular historical wrongdoing that took place in Canada, and also through the strong activism by Asian community groups here in Canada. like now we have so-called public apologies from the government. So because of that particular, that the public apologies, what I found out is many people really thought that historical things were now resolved with the public apologies. So one thing I really want to do is really like break that idea of public apology means the story is ended. So I think that's one of the things that as an Asian descent immigrants, I really want to work on is it's not about we have the apology and that's the end of story. It's more about that's the beginning of the story to continue our work and continue to educate public and educate us and how we can actually break that continuity of the historical racism. And I also think that now I've been here in Canada for 10 years, so I can't really speak about all activist history. But within my 10 years, I actually saw much more political mobilizations among us. And in Ottawa now we have created, like different local grassroots groups to continue our work against racism. So I actually see that like more grassroots activism, it doesn't need to be always institutional based, but I could see that much more fluid and activist activism could be continued. And also I believe more stories should be shared. And I was also working in a coffee shop, and I also met many people who are coming to Canada using the working and holiday visa, which is actually should be considered as a worker's visa, but it's not actually. And we have actually much more diversity within us, and I hope more stories are shared, and that's again one way we can break that homogenized understanding of Asians and one narratives that has been created by mainstream media. So I think more stories need to be shared, and yeah, that is the way that I believe.
Thank you, Jiyoung. Avvy, what would you like to add?
What was the question again? Like-
the question really goes to action.
Okay,
What
okay.
happens beyond awareness and recognition of anti-Asian racism? What would you like to see people that are participating in terms of them as individuals, their organization, groups they belong to? What can they do as allies? What can they do in terms of taking action?
Yeah, sure. So like on top of the, sort of learning the history, all that kind of stuff, like I'm more interested in like policies, sort of structural change. So I think maybe if you're within your own workplace, I would recommend or strongly recommend looking at from your organizational point of view, do you would your policies, procedures, practices, or even representation, are they consistent with a racial equity kind of approach to things? Like, do you apply racial equity lens or use a racial equity impact analysis tool to make sure that your policies, procedures do not create artificial barriers, do not perpetuate discrimination and, of any forms. And I think that having representation, not just of Asian Canadians, I know representation alone is not enough, like it's necessary but not sufficient. But we really need to make sure that our organizations reflect the people of Canada. Like, I just don't believe that, like if it's not important, then why do we only have white people at the top? So I think, so those are the things that I think important, but I think also at the same time, look outward, like, in the sense of, are you supporting any community organizations that are advocating for racial equity, calling for systemic change? So, sort of, are you kind of supporting their efforts to push for strong anti-Asianism measure legislation? strong employment equity law, right, for all provinces, and strengthen the Federal Employment Equity Act, strong social support, economic policies and programs that lift every person up, to eliminate poverty. So all of those things I think are important for us to consider. So we're not just staying at this very kind of superficial,
Right.
stop the hate kind of,
Mhm.
conversation, right?
Mhm. Okay, I'm going to ask Diane and Jasmine to now present some questions from our participants.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentations. A lot of different comments and questions coming in, many of them expressing their appreciation as well. I'm going to start with one. They were hoping to understand the model minority myth or complex a bit better. And so they asked, is it the case that it just doesn't exist, or this myth exists and has impacts, but it's false? And it came up during Jiyoung's presentation, so perhaps I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, the myth exists, that's for sure. I think Avvy was also mentioning that how this myth has been really powerful for the people in high level, can be as a tool to discourage any policy changes. And also it has been used both within Asian community, like to blame each others, or to be and also against other racialized groups, saying that, like, very much highlighting a few Asian cases of success, as if it is really speak to the whole community. And that's why the idea of honorary white, which is, I would say, very derogatory way of calling Asians, has been actually exist on that Wikipedia page. So I can say, yes, myth definitely exists. So my job is more to break the myth, because it actually was not helping anyone other than the existing the power, and that and also consolidating the existing racial hierarchies.
That's great. Thank you. Kelly and Avvy, you're welcome to add if you'd like to.
Yeah, so I would say that the myth for sure exists, and then then whether or not it exists in reality, then like it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe in the myth, then it's reality, right? So a lot of people will say, well, look at all these rich Hong Kong Chinese or mainland Chinese buying houses in whatever in Lower Mainland or Toronto. Of course, there will always be some rich Hong Kong Chinese and rich mainland Chinese, but similarly, there are a lot of rich white people, right? So it's like, if you're you want to believe in the myth, then you will point to evidence that support your belief, right? So I think that's what myth does, right? You can always find some evidence to say, like this is real, right? Whereas if you look at the broader picture, then we can poke a lot of holes in it. Particularly, we need to talk about the harmful impact that John talks about, right?
And if I just add one more time, maybe we can ask who really want to promote that model minority myth. So the question goes to like them, why they want to promote.
That's great. Thank you.
The next question is, I would like to know what you deem to be the problematic aspects of the role of the IRCC in the CBSA as they relate to immigrant Asian women, including sex workers, and what proposed changes or adjustments they can undertake in order to avoid victimizing racialized women. Perhaps, Kelly, we can start with you.
Yeah, so with RLPC, so the Immigration Prohibition on Sex Work, this restricted work permit, it increased immigration enforcement, because when a migrant workers come here to do sex work, it is deemed as illegal. Essentially, it increased surveillance, arrest, deportation, and detention. Also, racial profiling by law enforcement On top of that, there is abusive investigative practices raised by police and CBSA, whether it's on suspicions of trafficking or suspicion of someone violating the immigration prohibition. So this also leads to when a woman who are here with precarious status doing sex work and they became a victim of a crime, it means that when they report to the police, when their names are run, CBSA are also alerted, at least in all of the cases that we've dealt with. And because of that, in many instances, the crime itself that were reported was not investigated, but the investigation turned into the work itself. And in many cases, women were simply deported because they were found simply breaking the immigration prohibition. But the crime that the victims, so let's say they were a victim of a robbery, it was never addressed. So, and even if not arrested or deported, the collaboration between police, the Canada Border Services Agency means that there are no safe way for immigrant or migrant workers to report violence because of this fear of deportation. And so essentially it's simply creating this vicious cycle where there is no safety. In many situations, what's needed is labor rights, but because there were so many prohibition in Canada on sex work, there is no legal right, but they simply deem everything as trafficking. So again, when women don't play or don't portray this traffic victim role, then they're simply deported in many cases. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. Jiyoung and Avvy, would you like to add anything?
Maybe I'll add. I think that, sort of like, so Kelly talks about one particular type of work, right? So I think that ultimately the issue is around what kind of work is being valued and which workers are being valued, right? And that speaks to the entire immigration system. So for instance, like, why would live-in caregivers, unlike other temporary, many other type of skilled workers, they have to come here and work for a few years without full status. They are not given full status upon arrival, but you have to work as caregivers first before you get a permanent resident status. Why is that kind of work treated differently from other kind of work? Of course, there's a race and gender, issue behind it. Who are being, what kind of education background or what kind of skills is being awarded with, sort of like the provincial nominee program, skilled workers program that allow you to just land upon arrival. And even that in and of itself, I think tend to also tend to favor men over women, considering in the gender discrimination in many countries of origin from which immigrants are coming to Canada. And then on the other hand, as we allow skilled workers to come in, we are moving away from family class immigrants, program, which tend to favor women because many women used to come to Canada as spousal sponsors, program. But also women are also more likely than men to want to sponsor their parents to Canada. But then if you want to sponsor parents, you have to have, meet certain income requirements, which women, particularly women of color, tend not to be able to meet because of discrimination in the workforce. So I think, there are a lot of these structural kind of racism and sexism within the workplace, within our economy, and yet at the same time, our immigration is very much an economic policy as opposed to a humanitarian policy. And then so the same kind of ideas behind whose work is worth and which workers are worth our protection, or which workers are worth given the permanent resident status for, inform all aspects of the immigration policy.
Thank you.
I just want to add, it's just reminded me of a quote that a Thai sex work support organization called Empower, they keep on asking in some of their reports, they ask, why is the world so afraid of having working class, non-English speaking and predominantly non-white women moving around the world for work? So I think that's a question that is really important for everyone to keep in mind, to really look at what assumption or the system is making.
Yeah, I also really like to add that, like, even though that Asians women have been really preferred in international labor market, however, they have been also been not much favored to becoming permanent residents or having a status. So I think Asian women's work has been really celebrated as an ideal labor force. However, they have been at the same time like systemically excluded to be part of the receiving society. So I also want to emphasize how that idea and logic pictures of Asian women as being an ideal worker never be translated into being treated equally and fairly and having, you know, as someone who deserve the same rights as others.
Thank you.
Okay, I know we are at 2:31, and Linda's going to come on shortly to wrap us up, but I just have one final question that I think will be really useful. It's actually directed towards Avvy. Someone was wondering if you could speak to the work that the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic does. They were wondering specifically if you provide legal advice / support to victims of crime.
So we are a community-based legal clinic. We're funded by Legal Aid Ontario. So we serve people from the 4 communities that I mentioned, non-English speaking, low income. So I guess the majority of the work that we do is really in, how should I say it? Like the other side is the government. So for instance, it's in immigration law, people accessing benefits like, you know, provincial and federal benefits. But we also do things like housing. So we represent tenants. We represent workers who are, you know, trying to, you know, who are being cheated of their, you know, wages from employer. We also do like some human rights work, police complaint, you know, even income tax matters. You know, the CCP is actually a challenge to the Income Tax Act. So I guess it's really, we try to inform our work based on the needs of the community and also what will be what could drive policy change that affect low income people. So I guess that's sort of the underlying rationale for the kind of work that we do. So if you're a victim of crime, we don't necessarily provide any specific support unless there's an legal issues that we need to deal with. So for instance, if you're a domestic violence victim, we don't provide counseling support, right? We're not counselors. But if the person wanted to access, you know, some services or benefits and not able to get it for whatever legal issues that they are encountering, then we may try to help them. Or in our case, many of the clients come to us because they want to get immigration status. So, but we're not providing support for victims of crime per se, more like we're assisting them with their legal issues.
I am going to pop back on. I am sorry to bring this conversation to an end, but we are out of time. I just want to thank each of you, to Kelly Go from our West Coast, to Avvy from Central Canada, and to Dr. Jiyoung Lian, who, when she joined the webinar, it was 1:30 a.m. where she is right now. So I just want to thank you all for the rich, meaningful discussion. And I hope that we can come together again to continue the discussion at a later date. And I also want to remind our participants that the link for the evaluation is in the chat box, and that your certificate of participation will be generated after you complete the evaluation. And then we'll roll up the evaluation and share it with our wonderful panelists in a day or so. So with that, again, thank you all. And thank you to our participants as well. Bye.